In this video, we're going to talk about procedures, or more technically, stored procedures. A procedure is a piece of code that runs when somebody calls it by its name. So if you think back to Java programming or C# programming, it's a method, right? People can pass a parameter to the method if they want to. Some code will run and it will return a value. Procedures can do all of that. And the nice part about it is we can provide those to people so that rather than having to do a complex query, they can run the procedure. The advantages of using a procedure is that, one, we can give the people we want permissions to it without giving permissions directly to the underlying data. It's centralized and consistent, kind of like a method. We don't have to, when people call it, all they need to know is the name and what to pass it and what information they're going to get back. They don't have to know how the code inside of it works. And if we decide to change how the code inside the stored procedure works, it doesn't affect anything else as long as the method's, the signature stays the same. Call it by a certain name, pass a certain parameter to get a certain piece of information back. The other advantage it has is that it's more efficient. Every time you run a piece of SQL code, the SQL server gets the statement that you pass it. It needs to come up with a plan on how to execute that code. With a stored procedure, the server processes that, figures out an execution plan ahead of time, and keeps it with the stored procedure. That way, when somebody calls the stored procedure's name, it doesn't have to come up with an execution plan. It already knows it. In other words, it compiles the code into something it can execute, and execute much more quickly because it doesn't have to figure out how to execute it. It just has to go get the data that it needs. Let's look at a stored procedure. So if we come into our database here, we're going to be in AdventureWorks. Let's go down here to Programmability, and you can see there's a folder where all the stored procedure objects are kept. And here's a stored procedure called USP, User Stored Procedure. Get Bill of Materials. So let's go look at this stored procedure. Let me hit Modify. And this is a large, complex piece of code, stored procedure, to get the bill of materials when somebody needs a bill of materials from their quote. If you look at this, we can figure out what it takes. Look at these two things. When somebody runs get bill of materials, they will have to provide a starting product ID as an integer and a date time. And then it comes go down here and it does some select statement, does a whole lot of calculations. Here's two select statements that are union together, if you remember union, right? And then it selects some things out and runs what they need to run. I mean, we don't need to understand how get bill of materials works. If we want to call it, we can call it. In addition, stored procedures exist. If we can find them, let's look at the system stored procedures. So to get there, you want to go in databases, system databases. Remember, some of this is where we said all the things that make the database system work are actually stored in a database. And that's where we're at right now. We're in the master database. If we go down to Programmability, Stored Procedures, we can see all the system stored procedures, and there are a ton of them. Basically, all the commands that you can run, more advanced commands and things that you can run in Microsoft SQL Server are a bunch of stored procedures that do things for the users. You can read through and do what some of those do. You probably don't want to mess with them. You probably don't want to change them. But you can see stored procedures are a big deal. But to make a basic stored procedure, it's really not all that complicated. So let's make a stored procedure. I'm going to start by doing a simple select statement. We're going to make an email address list. So we're going to select, I'm going to go down here because I'm going to get information from the person.person table. And I'm going to go up here and hit my AdventureWorks because I'm not getting my nice little typing help that I like. The person.person table. We're going to join that to the person.email address table. So I'm going to give this one a name of P, and I'll give this one a name of E, an alias. Okay. Now that we have that, our select statement gets a little bit easier because I can use autocomplete. So I'm going to get the last name from the person table. And I'm going to concatenate that with, we'll put a comma and a space, and then concatenate with first name. So that'll give me last name, comma, first name for all of our users. And my second column is out of the email address table. I'm going to get their email address. So I'm going to make a list of people's last name, first name, and their email address. And we're going to join those two things on the standard business entity ID. P business entity ID is going to be equal to the E business entity ID. And I'm going to add a where clause here. So let's just, I just want to look up right now. I'm going to pretend this stored procedure. It's not a stored procedure yet. I'm going to use it to look people up by their last name. So I'll just use a test person right now, and I'm going to stick in Abel. And let's run this. Okay. So Catherine Abel, and there's her email address. So we get the last name and first name from the person.person table, and the email address from the person.email address table. Great. And we looked it up for one person. How do I make this a stored procedure? Okay. And it's as simple as, much like we did with views, we say create procedure. I can abbreviate it PROC. And I have to give it a name. So I'll call it get email. And then put as. So get a working query. And now I've turned it into a procedure. When I execute that, okay, on my AdventureWorks database, so I got to remember to go back to there. Programmability. Stored procedures. Do I need to refresh it? There it is. DBO get email. Okay, so we've created it. Now to execute it, all I have to do is type the command execute. And I used lowercase g. I should have gave it an uppercase G. And actually, before I do it, I want to fix something right now because I don't like doing it the wrong way. I am going to delete the stored procedure I just created. Okay. And I'm going to come up here and change it because I want to call it SP so that we know it's a stored procedure. Okay. So I'm going to use that abbreviation. I'm going to use a capital G there. To execute it now, we type exec, short for execute, and then we type its name, SP, get email. There it is. So instead of typing all this, I can just type execute sp.get email. And it couldn't find it. Did I type it wrong? Do I need to do that? Oh, I never ran this. That's why. There, I created it. Now it exists. Now I should be able to run it. There it is. All right. So it gives us the same information our select statement did. Now, it doesn't do me a whole lot of good to have a stored procedure just to pull Catherine Abel's email out for everybody, right? Do I do one for every user? I don't really want to do that. What I want to do is use a parameter so that somebody can pass in the name they're looking for, and then we get their information out. So how do I do that? Let's go up to here. Now, we can't create a stored procedure called get email because we already have a stored procedure called sp get email. So we're going to alter. So this is very similar to create table and alter table, right? And now we're going to alter the definition for what our stored procedure does. And we're going to put in a parameter by using the @ symbol. So we're basically making a variable here. At last name. Somebody can type the person's last name. We have to give it a data type. We'll say varchar 40. And another thing I can do, I'm going to go ahead and do this now, and we'll take it out in a minute. I'm going to specify a default value. Last name equals Abel. Okay. Now, instead of using a hard-coded name down here, I can use that variable at last name. Right. And I believe we're ready to go. Let's execute that. It completed successfully. Okay. So now we can come down and execute our stored procedure. And it gets out Catherine Abel because I didn't specify any parameters. It used the default parameter. But if I want to, I can specify a parameter following it. And remember, it has to be a string, so we put it in single quotes. And we can execute it that way. How do we know that worked? Let's get rid of this here. And let's redefine our stored procedure without a default value. Now, if I try to run it without a value, it says it expects a parameter for last name. So let's do it with a parameter. And there it is. Okay. So now we can specify anybody's last name, and it will pull their email out. I just paused the video so I could go look up somebody else's name to use. Let's try Walters here. And now when we execute it with Walters as our parameter, I get Rob Walters. Okay. So if we want to add another parameter, we can do that as well. I can just go here and say at first name. I need to separate them with commas. Varchar 40. So we'll run the alter table or alter procedure statement to change our procedure. Now if I try to run it with just Walters, expects a first name, and I didn't give it a first name. And I forgot, was it Rob Walters? Oops. Walters Rob, there it is. Why did I get it so many times? I'm not sure what I did. I might have made a mistake. Let's re-execute. Now let's run that again. There we go. It works just fine. All right. So that is stored procedures with parameters. You don't need to know how to make really complicated ones at this point in your life. But as you can see, the complicated part of this was really the select statement. If you know how to write queries, you might get some longer queries. some longer statements to change data or whatever, they can get a lot more complicated, but the process is always the same. Start with some code that works, then turn it into a procedure, add parameters that you need, and substitute the variables in. And you know what I didn't do on this? I used last name and first name, but I never actually used the first name. That was bad of me. And it didn't hurt us because we kept using the same email address. There's only one Walters in there, so that alters it. This runs it. All right, that's going to be it for stored procedures. The assignment for this section is to take the query you wrote for views and turn that into a stored procedure that lets me look up employees' telephone numbers using the same idea. I can type in, you only need to use one last name. I type in their last name. It'll show all those employees with their telephone number.